All right. Oh, cool. Didn't even have to log in or anything. Okay. So we had last week off for VBS, and we were back continuing our series, the God I Won't Believe In, where we're addressing common barriers to people accepting the gospel, people believing in God and people believing the Bible. And this week, we're talking about a super common objection. I think it's actually the number one objection that they took in the entire poll that this church did. It's a God who lets bad things happen to good people. So basically addressing the problem of evil and suffering in the world, of pain and death and illness and everything like that. He starts off this chapter of the book that we're teaching through with a really good personal story that I wanted to share with you guys. And as soon as I get it to come up, I'll be able to read it for you. It was up. Hold on. Please stand by. Kindle. Can somebody start humming or something? I mean, if I could make it go faster. Cool. Got it. All right. Here we go. Okay, so jumping right in. A God who lets bad things happen to good people. So, word on the street. He says, my wife, Rosemary, and I moved from Hungary to Colorado in 2012. We'd spent over a decade in Hungary, the last 7 years of which we had lived in the city of Eger, where we planted a church. On the day we left, a bunch of our friends and members of the church came over to set us off and say goodbye. Amongst them was a couple who had not been Christians when we first met them. They became Christians in our church, and I baptized them both. Not only did Janie and his wife become Christians in our church, but over the years, I trained them and ultimately ordained him as a pastor. When I left, Janie became the pastor of the church, which he still pastors to this day. That day, as we were gathered together to say our farewells before departing for Colorado, Janie and his wife announced to everyone that they were pregnant, expecting their second child. Their baby boy arrived a few months later in due course. A few months after that, I traveled back to Hungary, but not for a social visit, for a funeral. Their baby boy died. I officiated his funeral over a tiny casket. The couple had already become Christians, and they followed Jesus. Janie even became a pastor, leading a church. Why would a loving God allow something like this to happen? How could God do this, especially to people who are serving him and doing everything he's called them to do? God could have healed their baby, so why didn't he? 1 year after that, I was back in Hungary again for another funeral. This time, the funeral was for a friend of mine named Petty. Petty was 40 years old. He had a wife and 3 kids. He too was a pastor, and he got cancer. Within 1 year, he died. And many people prayed for God to heal him, but Petty didn't get better. You look at that and you wonder, how is this good? Who benefits from that? Nobody wins in this situation. Everyone loses because this man is gone. A widowed wife, and orphaned children, and a church without a pastor. Why? It's the number one issue that we received in our poll, the hardest struggle and the largest barrier for people to believe in God. Why God? People ask. If you love us and care about us, why do you let babies die? Why do you let good people like Petty die of cancer? And why didn't you heal him? Why do you let good people suffer like this? So tonight is kind of close to home for me and Rebecca, but the older you get, I'll just tell you, the more sad things and heartbreaking things you experience. And that's a very real and fair question. And God doesn't hide from our questions. He's not scared of them. He's ready for them. And this isn't a topic that we should run away from. We should ask this question and try to figure out, okay, what do we do with this? When God allows pain, or causes situations to come about that are tragic, where's he at? What's he doing? So that's our topic tonight, and I've specifically have things in here to help us keep it light and us not get too depressed, because it does have a good ending. So we're going to get there. So a God who lets bad things happen to good people. That's our topic tonight. Do you want me to tell you next slide? I'm looking at my stuff here, but do you want me to tell you next slide, or are you just going to watch where I'm at and just kind of go to the next one as you see me?
We can do both.
Okay.
If I get an inkling that you want to move on, I'll go ahead, but let me know as well.
Okay, so I'm on the next one. Okay. So this is a common position. So the number one issue received in their poll, the hardest struggle, the largest barrier for people to believe in God. Why God, people ask. If you love us and care about us, why do you let babies die? Why do you let good people like Petty die of cancer, like in his story? Why didn't you heal him? Why do you let good people suffer like this? So that's what the author says. So the problem of suffering, and there's 3 problems I want to address with suffering. Number 1, suffering is a personal thing. It's raw, it's gritty. We feel it in our souls. Like it's a very personal and close thing. Number 2, suffering is philosophical. And I'm going to explain what that means. And then 3, suffering is also biblical. Like we're going to encounter it. It's in this world. Believe me, these things are true about suffering. Okay, that didn't get as many laughs as the last one I did. Whatever.
There's not much that can top wrong.
It's true. All right, so the first one, suffering is personal. Let's talk about this. So, we as people, we try to make sense of suffering when we're going through it. Why this? Why me? How could anything good come out of this? Did I do something wrong? Did I do something to deserve this? And sometimes it can cause us to even doubt God. It would cause us to doubt his goodness. Maybe it causes people to doubt that he even exists. Maybe it causes people to doubt his power or ability to keep us safe from things. But it's not only our personal suffering, it's also a bigger sphere than that, because suffering is philosophical. We try to desperately make sense of our suffering, and it's the suffering of the multitudes, millions of people, billions of people around the planet that we see suffering. Just turn on the news or get on your news app or whatever. There were 10 million people, 10 million Africans were kidnapped and enslaved through the transatlantic slave trade. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. 1 million children are trafficked annually in the global sex trade. Over 1 million babies were aborted last year in the United States alone. 800,000 people die every year from diarrhea. Multitudes are killed in famine, drought, tsunamis, disease. Children suffer. People suffer from the abuse of people that should be caring for them and taking care of them, from parents and guardians abusing children. Now, to exist in the world and not lose our minds about this kind of stuff, we have to explain these terrible things somehow. We have to look at it in some way that helps us make sense of it all. It's usually like a philosophy or a worldview. And Richard Dawkins, who's a renowned atheist, he looks at all of this suffering and evil, and he says of our universe, he says that our universe has precisely the properties that we should expect if there is, at the bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Philosopher David Bentley Hart said, "One might conclude that the world contains far too much misery for the pious idea of a good and loving God to be taken seriously, and that any alleged creator of the universe in which children suffer and die hardly deserves our devotion." So the question is, are they right? Is the reality of evil and suffering in the world incompatible with the biblical teaching that a good, loving, and all-powerful God exists? Do suffering and evil discredit the Bible and what it says about God? Nope. Come on, people. Put these gifts in here for you. I'm trying to lighten the mood a little bit. I know it's a thick topic. Come on. look, I went through the ringer last year and I'm sitting here laughing, all right? We can do this. All right. Number 3, suffering is biblical. So the Bible has a lot to say about the issue of pain and suffering in the world. In fact, the oldest book in our Bibles, the book of Job, is largely focused on the issue of why do bad things happen to good people. Great, incredible book. I would definitely recommend you guys read it. It's not on our reading plan this year, but maybe next year. Genesis provides an explanation for our messed up world. Starting in Genesis. Garrett.
3! Oh, Genesis 3! I missed it.
Okay.
No way.
Okay, let's try that again.
Hold on.
Genesis provides an explanation for our messed up world in Genesis.
Genesis 3!
There we go. Thank you. Awesome. So in Genesis 3, we learn that God did not create the world as a place of suffering. There was no evil, there was no darkness, there was no pain, there was no wickedness. God created a good world. Evil entered into the world from the choice of human beings who rebelled against God. And sin is the ultimate cause at the macro level of suffering throughout human history. That's kind of the easy blanket answer. That's the causality. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't just tell us why evil and suffering are present in this world. It also tells us the good news of what God has done and what he is doing to bring an end to the evil and suffering that we see in the world. So the existence of evil and suffering is not an embarrassment to Christianity, or it's not a topic that we should avoid. It's a signpost which points us to the ultimate problem in the world, sin. For those of you who remember going through the 3 circles of evangelism training, what's the first circle on the left? God's design. The second circle is
Brokenness.
Yeah, brokenness, exactly. So that's basically the inlet to sharing the gospel, is people talking about how bad things are. And it's like, well, of course, there's sin in the world, there's rebellion in the world. The world has been cursed because of the selfishness of human beings, and God sent Jesus, God has a rescue mission to fix this. And so that's like your inlet to the gospel. So evil in the world, suffering in the world, it's a signpost that points us to the ultimate problem, sin, and the God-given solution follows in the hope of the gospel because of the existence of God. Now, are we good? Okay. Now, there's 2 kinds of suffering that I want us to take note of. Number 1, explicable suffering, which is suffering where the explanation is obvious to us, stuff that we can kind of wrap our heads around. Here's an example. Somebody develops a chronic lung disease because they were around toxic fumes for many years of their life. Maybe it was self-caused, like they were a chronic smoker, or maybe it was caused by other things like environmental pollution or secondhand smoke. Wasn't really their fault. Cause and effect are clear in this case, and we can trace it, we can explain it, we can know what is responsible, and perhaps even what we can do to prevent it from happening again. So that's explicable suffering. The second kind is inexplicable suffering, suffering where the explanation is unknown. We can't really wrap our heads around it. Here's an example. Random accidents that cause death and massive injury. Earthquakes, tsunamis, tornadoes, a young and seemingly healthy person suddenly and unexpectedly dying from a heart attack. We understand what happened, but we can't seem to figure out why it happened. It doesn't seem to make sense to us. We don't know who to blame. We don't know how we could have prevented it. And a lot of times we may not have been able to even prevent it, which is scary. Now, any questions so far? Okay. All right. So we've got 2 common responses to suffering that are both wrong. Suffering demands a response for us because it's personal, like we talked about. It challenges our philosophy and our worldview. Guys, I can tell you last year, my theology of suffering, what I understood about what the Bible said about suffering and God's role in that and what he'll allow, got completely blown to bits. My understanding of suffering was completely off and wrong. And it wasn't that I didn't think God wouldn't allow people to experience suffering, because Scripture says that we will, even as Christians. What I didn't understand was why, when I got on my face and fervently cried out to God to make it stop, it didn't stop when I wanted it to. He allowed it to linger and fester a little bit longer. And that to me was so confusing, and I didn't understand. And it was a hard place to be. A lot of times, I'll just say this, whether it's you or somebody that you're trying to support, if somebody's in a season of suffering, a lot of times the best thing you can do is just be present for them and be loving and supporting and affirming, not try to explain it to them, not try to help them intellectually figure it out, because they're not at a place where they can really do that yet. Like, they may try, but don't try to be the person with all the answers theologically and that kind of thing, because that's not going to be super helpful. It's going to be well-intending. It's not going to be super helpful. I've been in that situation, and the thing that helped me the best was the people that said, I really don't have an answer for you, but I love you. I'm right here with you. And if you need anything, please reach out. Like, that was the best help that I received. Now, as we kind of like went through those seasons and they kind of calmed down a little bit, we were able to process as the emotions kind of calmed down a little bit. Then you're able to say, okay, what do I do with this? How do I process this? Where was God in this situation? And then as you get a little further down the road, you can look back and say, okay, well, how did God use that in my life? How am I different? How's it impacted me personally, my relationship with God, my relationship with other people, the way that I view the world, the way that I can connect with other people? And you can see the silver lining. You can see the positives that came out of a tragedy. And we're going to talk a little more about that. We're still kind of on the negative side of this discussion right now, though. All right, so moralism. Moralism is the first common response to suffering that we're going to talk about. Moralism basically says, if you do all the right things, then God will protect you. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, essentially the secular concept of karma. If you're doing what God wants, He owes it to you to keep bad things from happening to you, right? If this is true, and God lets something bad happen, then He owes you an explanation because He didn't hold up His end of the agreement. Enter the original question, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? If I've been doing the right things, if I've been doing the right stuff, why is this in my life? Job called, what'd he say? He said, that's dumb and that's not how it works. In Job, it says that Job was a righteous and upright man, a man who followed God, who feared God, who loved God. And he was making sacrifice. In those days, obviously, Jesus hadn't come yet. He was making sacrifices on behalf of his children, who, after their like get-togethers and fellowships and stuff they would have, just in case they did something wrong. Like, this dude was covering his bases. He was sincere in seeking God. He said, should I accept good things from the hand of God and not just bad things? He's like, God has given me everything I have in the first place. So Job did nothing to warrant what happened to his life. He wasn't being punished or reprimanded by God. That can't happen. God does punish and God does reprimand, and God continually uses things in our lives to draw us back to Him, to repentance. It's always about reconciliation. It's always about getting us away from sin, if that's the problem, if that's what's going on. But that's not always the reason. It's not always we've done something wrong, like in Job's case. In John 9, 1 through 3, the disciples asked Jesus, it says, as He went along, Jesus, He saw a man blind from birth. And His disciples asked Him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? In their day, when somebody suffered misfortune like that from birth, like they were lame, they couldn't walk, or they were blind, or they couldn't hear, the assumption was that as an infant or an unborn child, this person sinned and God cursed them, or their parents did, and they inherited the consequence of that sin and wrongdoing. That's not really biblical. That's just what they thought, though, in the day. So Jesus said, neither this man nor his parents sinned for this to happen. He's like, that's not what it is at all. He said, but this happened, why? So that the works of God might be displayed in him. So what happened? Jesus was able to heal this guy in this moment and get people's attention that who He was, the Messiah, God in human flesh, and drew people to Him. People that could follow Him after being encountered with the living God in human flesh, who did this incredible miracle of healing somebody who had been born blind. And this guy got to be a part of that. The Bible does not teach moralism. Even those living well for the Lord will experience suffering. Even Jesus experienced suffering. All right. The next type, not moralism, but cynicism. Life stinks and then you die. Suffering is random. Bad things just happen. There's no rhyme or reason to the universe. We're just spinning on the ball. So the Bible disagrees with this as well. The world isn't random. God exists, and he is actively involved in creation. The truth is that we live in a broken world where sin and death are realities. And there's also a good and loving God who gives us hope and shows us how to respond to those realities without resorting to the blame game or giving up in life. All right. Go ahead and turn to John 11, 1 through 45. I don't have the verses on this. Where's mine? Yeah, on the shelf right over there. I said I don't have them up there. Forgot I needed my Bible tonight. All right. If I'm not mistaken, I think this is actually the last passage that I preached on. All right, John 11, 1 through 45. This is going to take a minute to walk through, but it's very, very, very relevant to what we're talking about tonight. Okay. You guys good? Got it? Cool. Okay. John 11, starting in verse 1. The death of Lazarus. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters, Mary and Martha, sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one that you love is sick. Jesus had a close personal relationship with these people. They were more than just his followers, but there was something more there. They had spent time together, probably obviously in each other's homes, as Jesus taught. So they knew him. There was trust established there. There was a relationship established there. They weren't strangers. Verse 4, when Jesus heard this, he said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, obviously we know Lazarus dies, but Jesus brings him back to life. So the ultimate situation for Lazarus is that this is not a permanent death for him in this present moment. That's why he's saying this does not end in death. So, verse 5, pay attention here. It says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So, first word, also meaning therefore, which also means why. This is why. Because he loved them, don't miss this, when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. If you're a doctor and you know that somebody is sick, do you normally wait on purpose a couple more days before you go check them out?
No.
That doesn't make any sense.
The longer you wait, the harder it can be to cure them.
Exactly.
Cancer.
That's what everybody's thinking here. That's why this is so confusing to them. And if you don't understand it, it can be confusing to us. So pay attention to that. It says, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed there 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, hey, let's go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you. And yet you want to go back? And Jesus answered, are not there 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. He's saying, I've got to make best use of the time that God has given me to be on the earth and do my ministry right now. We need to go. So after he said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. And Jesus had been speaking of his death, but the disciples thought he meant a natural sleep. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there so that you may believe. Second motivation for not going there early before he died. First one was because he loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Second one, so that these guys may believe. In what? We're going to see. How's his love going to be expressed? We're going to see. But let us go to him. Verse 16, then Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. So they were just trying to, they were just trying to kill Jesus in this area, and they were all concerned. And Thomas mistakenly was like, well, let's go, we might die. But like, that's not what Jesus was saying. All right, verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. That's significant. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles away from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Mary and Martha to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. Lord, Martha said, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. So she's essentially saying, Jesus, I don't understand this. I know who you are, and I believe in what you can do, and I've seen it, and I've heard your teachings. If you had been here, we sent word, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So she's essentially saying, I don't understand this. And she's probably a little agitated. She's probably a little angry. Understandably so. She's grieving the loss of her brother. And she may not expect, she doesn't seem to expect something like a resurrection in this moment, but she still expresses this display of faith by saying, even now I know that God will give you what you ask, or even now, yeah, God will give you whatever you ask. So 23, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. So she's talking about like at the end of the time on the earth, the resurrection where God raises up his people, and the lost alike, everybody for judgment. She's thinking like final resurrection type stuff, like eschatology. And that's not what he meant. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. So people are resurrected because of Jesus. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. He's talking about eternal life through him. And whoever lives believes in me, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? He's talking about eternal life. And she says, yes, Lord. She replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. So she's a believer. 28. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. She said, the teacher is here, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. Verse 31. When the Jews who had been with Mary were in the house comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out. They followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, same thing that her sister said. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Confused, angry, crushed, heartbroken, experiencing suffering and grief of the loss. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled, and says, where have you laid him? Come and see, Lord, they replied. And then the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Now, Jesus clearly knows that what's about to happen. He knows that he's about to resurrect Lazarus. So why is he weeping? He's most likely not weeping for Lazarus' death because he knows that he's about to bring him up. But remember who this is. This is the God who created the world that we talked about in the beginning of tonight, that created a good world that had no death, that had no suffering, that had no grief or tears or misery. And he's looking at this. He's looking at the effect of the broken world that he made. How do you think God feels when he looks at the world? We're just creatures that were made and put here, right? But how do you think God feels from his perspective as the one who made the thing? And then he sees the brokenness in it and the pain that it causes to his creatures that he loves. He's probably angry and grieved. It says he's troubled and moved in his spirit. He hates it. He hates sin. He hates death. He hates pain. He hates suffering. All of these things he can't stand. Because it points to the fact that the thing that he made, us and the world and everything in it, is messed up. And we have to endure that. And he doesn't like it. I mean, he doesn't want us to. That's not what he made it for. So he's grieved. He's weeping. And the Jews are thinking, oh, this is for his love for Lazarus, and that's how they took it. But some of them said, Could not he who, same thing that Mary and Martha were thinking, right? Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying? Everybody's kind of got this idea in their head, right? Verse 38, Jesus once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb, and it was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. He says, take away the stone. But Lord, Martha said, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been there for 4 days. Now, another kind of wonky thing that the Jews believed in this day, they believed that after a person dies, their spirit, their soul, right, kind of hovers over the body for 3 days. So if there's any chance for a miracle or hope of resuscitation, it has to happen within the first 3 days. This is one of the reasons why it seems that why Jesus waited to the 4th day, to show that he is the master over life and death. He is the one who controls these things. And it's not just some ordinary prophet who's just working miracles through, like that God's working miracles through. No, there's something different here. He says that I am the resurrection and the life to Martha. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and he said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of those standing here. He's praying right out loud, and he's talking about the benefit of the people around him, that they may believe that you sent me. So he's trying to draw people, he's trying to draw their attention to him for salvation. Verse 43, so when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped up in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to him, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And what happened? What was the result? Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. Let's consider the benefits. So the tragedy first is that he allowed this guy to die. Mary and Martha were suffering and confused. They believed that Jesus could have kept this from happening. But what came from their suffering? Their relationship with Jesus was strengthened. Their connection with him was made stronger. They grew in their faith and their trust. Other people there believed in Jesus because of this incredible miracle of him turning back death on its head. The disciples were there and they witnessed it, and their faith was strengthened because of it. They saw who it was that they were following. It was somebody that could control nature, somebody that could heal people, somebody that could bring people back from the dead, cast out demons, do all these incredible things. It's more than just a regular Old Testament prophet. It's God in human flesh. And Martha attested to that. Peter has attested to that. If our goal in life is to just be comfortable, then you and I will always view suffering as an unwelcome intrusion, a distraction and an annoyance at best, enraging and confusing at worst. However, if our life's purpose is about more than our own happiness and comfort, if the purpose, meaning, and goal of our life is fellowship with God and being used by him to accomplish his mission and change the world, then suffering absolutely has its value. When I think back on our terrible last year, some of the things that I've noticed that came out of that are that my relationship with my wife, Rebecca, has never been stronger. God used that situation to meld us so much closer than we were before. And we had a good relationship, but there's just something different about it when you walk through a bitter season with somebody, when you walk through something challenging with somebody and you have to actually be selfless and hold each other up while you're both clinging. So he used that to grow and bless our marriage, which I am so grateful for. As bad as last year was, I am so grateful for a positive that came out of it. She and I individually have been able to have various conversations with people since then that have suffered in the same ways and different ways than the stuff that we had gone through last year, and be an encouragement to them and love on them and share with them what God had taught us through bitter seasons, and pray for them and check up on them and help support them, and basically tell them just that God has a purpose, that God can redeem anything, that it's not for no reason. So let's tie this together. Let's kind of wrap this up a little bit and try to walk away with some things. So God, in his love, uses suffering in our lives to accomplish good things. Like what? Drawing people to himself. Like in the case of Lazarus, like in the case of the prodigal son. In the case of the prodigal son, you see this son that disregards his father completely, takes half of his inheritance, which is essentially saying in their culture, Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me all the stuff that you owe me. So he takes that, leaves. You guys know the story. He wastes it all. And he's starving to death in a famine in a distant land. And he's like, man, even the servants that work for my dad are in better shape than I am right now. I'm going to go back and just, maybe he'll take me on and let me work for him as a servant. And you see the heart and the compassion. You see the excitement that he had for his son from a distance, and he ran, which was a huge cultural no-no. It was dishonoring for a Jewish man, a grown Jewish man, to run, essentially. But you see the heart, you see the compassion, you see the love and the strengthening of the relationship. Suffering produces humility. James 4:6 says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. One of the things, and I believe it's in Proverbs, it talks about the things that God hates more than other things. Hands that shed innocent blood, feet that race to do wicked things. And one of those things is a haughty spirit, a prideful spirit. That's one of the things that God hates. Essentially, they say that really pride was at the root of the first sin, because whenever we choose to sin, we're saying that we know better than God does. So God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Paul's thorn in his flesh, we see this in 2 Corinthians. It says that it was designed to keep him humble. If somebody had a reason for being proud as much as God used them, it was Paul. I mean, Christianity spread into Europe because of this guy. And he planted so many churches, discipled so many people, spread the gospel so many places, did an incredible ministry. It would have been very easy in his flesh to get prideful and big-headed. But God gave him this thorn in the flesh, this thing that continually helped keep him humble, that he asked God to take it away, but God left it there. He said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. I'm going to leave that there to help keep you humble. Suffering builds perseverance and character and hope in our lives. Romans 5:3-4 says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together. Sorry, that's Romans 8:8. All things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Think of Joseph, right? What Joseph said was, when his brothers apologized and he met with them in Egypt, he said, guys, I've forgiven you. He's like, what you intended for evil, God used for good. God intended for good. The idea that even in the presence of wickedness and people doing terrible things to one another, God can redeem that situation and bring something positive out of it, even if we don't understand it. Romans 5:3-4 says, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. James 1 says, count it all joy when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that it's the development of your character that will result in that. So God basically uses tough situations like the pressure on what? Is it carbon? Pressure on carbon that produces a diamond, is that what it is? Yeah. So the idea is that he's refining us. And it's a gritty process. But we become more and more like Jesus through this. Jesus and the disciples, essentially, like, there is going to be a rub here. If you're actually living faithfully, if you're following Jesus, you're going to be a little different from the rest of this world, because you have a relationship with God, you're connected with him, and you view life different and you live life different if you're being obedient. Just like Jesus, and they resisted him, they're going to resist us too. And that's naturally going to cause tough situations. but God rewards us for it, and he makes us more and more like Jesus through it. Another reason for suffering that God has is to advance the gospel. We saw all the people that God saved just in that Lazarus passage, right? So Garrett, can you take over the slides real quick so she can get the voice? Thanks. All right, so Paul wrote to the Philippians from jail, right? He was a victim of injustice, we're almost done, and corruption. Paul said in Philippians 1:12, he says, I want you to know that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. And then another one is that it can bring glory to God. So turning our back on God won't stop us or anybody else from suffering. Turning to God, however, and taking hold of his gospel promise and trusting in and relying on and clinging to Jesus, that will change things. For the believer, one day all suffering will be done. And Jesus willingly suffered so that through him, suffering would one day end for all who belong to the family of God. So that our suffering until then would have a purpose. It would have value, and he could redeem it for our good, the good of other people, and for his glory. So here's the big question. Since we know that God is good, God is loving, and God is wise, will you and I trust him even when we don't understand, even when it hurts us and other people that we love? At the end of the day, are we going to trust him? And that's what it really boils down to. There's nothing easy about this. This isn't shallow Christianity. This is the real deal. This is deep, hard, gritty stuff. But it's true and it's real. God can redeem suffering, and he does. And it's so difficult, and none of us, nobody in their right mind would ever pick it. But if we find ourselves in the midst of it, we need to remember that God allowed that or caused it, and that he wants to use it for a good purpose, for our good, and for his glory, and for the good of other people. That's a hard pill to swallow, but it's true, and it's biblical. So do we trust him? Do we trust him? That's all I've got. Gary, you can hit the button on the camera.